Welcome to the Sleep Dial, where history whispers you to sleep. Tonight, we journey through the Roman Empire, not with tales of conquest, but with stories of innovation, architecture, and daily life. From bustling forums to serene villas, discover the empire's legacy beyond the battlefield. So, settle in, close your eyes, and let the echoes of ancient Rome lull you into tranquility. First, we will be taking a walk alongside ancient Rome. The streets here are narrower, often unpaved or paved with rougher stones, and they wind more organically than the grand, straight avenues. We are now in a residential and commercial district, likely dominated by the towering apartment blocks, the insulae, that house the majority of the urban population. The first thing that strikes you is the sheer density of life. These neighborhoods were crowded. People are everywhere, walking, talking, carrying goods, leading animals, children playing. The air is thick with a cacophony of sounds. From the open doorways and windows of the insulae, you hear the murmur of conversations, the cries of babies, perhaps the sound of someone practicing a musical instrument, or the rhythmic thump of a loom from a weaver's workshop. Street vendors, or circulators, are a constant source of noise, loudly hawking their wares. One might be selling hot sausages, his voice rising above the din. Farsimina! Farsimina Kalida! Another might offer cool drinks, or cheap trinkets, or mended shoes. You hear the clatter of wooden cartwheels on the uneven stones, the braying of a donkey struggling with its load, the barking of dogs, and the cooing of pigeons that seem to be a permanent fixture of any city. If it's morning, the sounds of workshops opening up would be prominent. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby forge, the rasp of a saw from a carpenter's shop, the chatter of customers at a bakery. And then there are the smells. A Roman street was a rich tapestry of odors, not all of them pleasant by modern standards. Mingling with the enticing aroma of baking bread from a pistrinum, bakery, or roasting meat from a popina, a sort of fast food bar and tavern, there would be less appealing scents. The lack of comprehensive sanitation in many parts of the insulae meant that chamber pots were often emptied into the street, especially at night, despite laws against it. The smell of refuse, animal dung, and overflowing cesspits could be pungent, particularly in the poorer, more crowded areas or during hot weather. However, you might also catch the scent of incense wafting from a small neighborhood shrine, the fragrance of flowers from a window box, or the sharper smells of a dyer's workshop using various chemicals and natural dyes. Tanneries, which used urine and other strong substances in their processes, were usually located on the outskirts of towns or in specific quarters for good reason, but their presence could still be felt on the wind. The overall olfactory experience would be intense and varied, a constant reminder of the close proximity of so many different human and animal activities. Let's look more closely at the buildings themselves. The insulae often rise 3, 4, even 5 or 6 stories high, sometimes precariously so. The ground floors are typically occupied by shops or tabernae. These are usually single rooms, open to the street, with wide doorways that might be closed at night with wooden shutters. Above these shops are the apartments, or sonacula. The quality and size of these apartments varied greatly. Those on the lower floors, being more accessible and often larger, were more desirable and expensive. As you went higher, the apartments became smaller, darker, and more cramped, often subdivided into single rooms rented out to the poorest inhabitants. Many of these upper-story rooms would have lacked direct water access, cooking facilities, or private latrines. Residents would have to carry water up from public fountains and cook on portable braziers, a constant fire hazard in these timber-framed and often poorly maintained buildings. Indeed, collapses, ruinae, and fires, incendia, were terrifyingly common occurrences in Roman cities. Augustus created a corps of watchmen, the vigils, who acted as both firefighters and a sort of night police, but the risks remained high. Peering into the tabernae as we walk, we see a vibrant commercial life. Here's a tunstrina, a barber shop. It's likely a social hub, where men gather not just for a shave, with surprisingly sharp iron razors, or a haircut, but also to exchange news and gossip. Next to it might be a suitor, a shoemaker, with leather hides and finished sandals and boots on display. Further down, a fullo, or fuller, is at work. This was the Roman equivalent of a dry cleaner, and a vital trade for cleaning woolen garments, especially togas, which were notoriously difficult to keep white. The fuller's shop would have vats where garments were trodden by foot in a mixture of water, fuller's earth, a type of clay, and often stale urine, collected from public urns, as the ammonia was an effective cleaning agent. The smell from a falarnica would be distinctive, to say the least. We pass a thermopolium, literally a hot drink shop. These were incredibly common and served as bars and simple eateries, catering to the many Romans who lacked cooking facilities at home. They typically had an L-shaped counter facing the street, often with large earthenware jars, dolia, sunk into it, which would have held wine, hot water, or pre-cooked food like stews, sausages, or lentils. Customers could get a quick, cheap meal or a cup of wine, often standing at the counter or sitting on simple stools. These were lively places, frequented by ordinary working people. Then there are the food markets, or makella. While the Grand Forum might have specialized markets, neighborhood markets were essential for daily provisions. Imagine a bustling open area, or a covered portico, filled with stalls. Farmers from the surrounding countryside would bring their produce, baskets overflowing with seasonal vegetables like cabbages, leeks, beans, and gourds, fruits such as figs, grapes, apples, and pears. There would be stalls selling cheese, olives, and honey. A butcher might be skillfully carving up a pig or a side of goat, the fresh meat displayed for customers. Fishmongers would have their catch laid out on cool stone slabs, perhaps still glistening from the sea or river. The air here would be a mix of earthy smells from the vegetables, the sweet scent of fruit, the sharper tang of cheese, and the metallic odor of fresh meat and fish. Haggling over prices would be common, the vendors calling out to attract customers, and shoppers carefully inspecting the goods. These markets were not just places of commerce but also important social spaces, where people met, exchanged news, and caught up on local happenings. Street life itself is a constant performance. You might see a fortune teller with a trained bird picking out written fortunes, or a snake charmer, or itinerant musicians playing a pipe or a small lyre, hoping for a few coins. Children dart in and out, playing games like tag or knucklebones, astragali, in the alleyways. Beggars, some with genuine disabilities, others perhaps less so, would plead for alms. Wealthier individuals might be carried through the crowds in litters, lectiki, by their slaves, trying to remain above the fray. You might see a public crier, or preco, announcing official news, an upcoming auction, or a lost item. Processions, whether for a local religious festival or a neighborhood guild celebration, could suddenly fill the street with music, chanting, and costumed participants. One feature of Roman urban life that often surprises people is the prevalence of public toilets, or foriki. While wealthy homes had private latrines, most inhabitants of insulae relied on public facilities. These were not the private cubicles we're used to. A Roman public latrine typically consisted of a long marble or wooden bench with multiple holes, often arranged around three sides of a room. There was no privacy between users. Water would flow continuously in a channel beneath the seats to carry away waste. Patrons would use a xylospongium or tussorium, a natural sponge attached to a stick, for cleaning, which would then be rinsed in the running water or in a bucket of vinegar water and left for the next person. Despite sounding rather communal to us, these latrines were often quite elaborately decorated with mosaics, frescoes, and even statues, and could be places for social interaction, much like the public baths. They were a practical solution to a pressing urban need and a testament to Roman civic organization, even if the hygiene standards weren't always perfect. As we walk, our eyes are drawn to the walls of the buildings. They are often covered in graffiti. This wasn't just random vandalism. It was a vibrant form of public communication, a sort of ancient social media. People scratched or painted messages, announcements, advertisements, political slogans, personal boasts, declarations of love, insults, and even poetry onto any available surface. Archaeologists in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum have found thousands of examples. You might see an advertisement for an upcoming gladiatorial show, detailing the number of pairs of gladiators and any special attractions. A candidate for local office might have his supporters paint slogans like "Vote for Marcus," or "All the fruit sellers urge you to elect Gaius." Someone might scrawl a romantic plea, "Successus the weaver loves Iris the innkeeper's slave girl, but she doesn't care for him. But he begs her to take pity on him," written by his rival. So long. Another might be a simple shopping list, a crude drawing, or a philosophical quote. There are even examples of children's practice alphabets. This graffiti gives us an incredibly vivid and personal glimpse into the thoughts, concerns, and daily interactions of ordinary Romans. It tells us what they cared about, who they supported, who they loved, and who they disliked. It makes the ancient city feel much more alive and relatable. The shops, or tabernae, that line these streets are diverse. We've mentioned some, but there would be many others. A lamp seller, Lucinarius, might have terracotta oil lamps of various designs displayed. A potter, Figulus, would have stacks of amphorae, bowls, and cooking pots. A textile merchant might sell bolts of linen from Egypt or wool from Gaul. There would be shops selling tools, glassware, perfumes, and medicines, often of dubious efficacy. Many artisans would both produce and sell their goods in the same premises. You might see a sculptor working on a statue in his workshop, or a mosaicist carefully setting tiny colored stones, tesserae, into a larger design. The sounds of their work, the chipping of stone, the tapping of a hammer, would add to the street soundscape. The flow of water is another constant presence. While not every apartment had running water, public fountains, fonts, were numerous and essential. These were often elaborately decorated and served as focal points in neighborhoods. People would gather at the fountains to collect water in jars and buckets, to wash clothes, and to socialize. The overflow from these fountains, and from the aqueducts that fed them, often ran in channels along the sides of the streets, helping to flush away some of the surface debris. We should also be aware of the less visible, but equally important, aspects of neighborhood life. There were local associations, or collegia. These were guilds for various trades, like the bakers, the boatmen, or the silversmiths, or burial societies that ensured members received a proper funeral, or even social clubs dedicated to a particular deity or just for companionship. These collegia often had their own meeting places, patron deities, and organized communal meals and celebrations, fostering a sense of community and mutual support among their members. These collegia often had their own meeting places, patron deities, and organized communal meals and celebrations, fostering a sense of community and mutual support among their members. Religious life was also very local. In addition to the grand temples in the city center, neighborhoods would have their own small shrines and altars, perhaps at crossroads, compita, dedicated to local guardian spirits or popular deities. Residents would make small offerings, light lamps, or say prayers at these local sacred spots. The lares compitales, guardians of the crossroads, were particularly important for neighborhood identity and cohesion. As evening approaches, the character of the street might change again. Shops would close, their wooden shutters secured. The thermopolia and popini might become rowdier as people finished their workday and sought refreshment and company. Oil lamps would begin to flicker in doorways and windows, casting long shadows. The streets themselves were generally unlit, making travel at night potentially hazardous, not just from tripping on uneven surfaces, but also from the risk of robbery or assault. Those who had to go out at night would often carry their own lamps or torches, and wealthier individuals would be accompanied by slaves carrying lights and providing protection. The vigils would patrol, but they couldn't be everywhere. This walk through a Roman neighborhood reveals a world that is intensely human, a place of constant activity, noise, and smell. It's a world of close-packed living, where public and private life were often intertwined, and where the daily struggle for existence coexisted with vibrant commerce, social interaction, and a rich tapestry of local customs and beliefs. It's far removed from the pristine marble ruins we often associate with ancient Rome, but it is in these crowded, messy, and lively streets that the vast majority of Romans lived out their lives, contributing in their own ways to the enduring fabric of the empire. It was a world where survival depended on community, resourcefulness, and the ability to navigate the complex social and physical environment of the ancient city. As the floodwaters receded, the basket came to rest at the base of a fig tree, the Ficus ruminalis. What happened next is one of the most iconic images of Roman mythology. The twins were found by a she-wolf, the lupa. Instead of harming them, the she-wolf suckled them, keeping them alive. A woodpecker, a bird sacred to Mars, also reputedly brought the morsels of food. This imagery of the wolf and the twins became a potent symbol of Rome itself, wild, nurtured by nature and the gods, and resilient. Eventually, the twins were discovered by a shepherd named Faustulus, who worked for King Amulius. He took them home to his wife, Acca Laurentia, and they raised the boys as their own. Romulus and Remus grew up to be strong, brave, and natural leaders among the other shepherds, often engaging in disputes with the shepherds of Numita, their unknowing grandfather. It was during one such dispute that Remus was captured and brought before Numita. Numita, struck by Remus's noble bearing and some accounts of his past, began to suspect his true identity. Meanwhile, Faustulus, fearing for Remus, revealed the truth about their origins to Romulus. Romulus then gathered a band of shepherds, stormed Amulius's palace, killed the usurper, and restored Numitor to the throne of Alba Longa. Remus, on the Aventine, was the first to see a sign, 6 vultures. He sent word to Romulus, claiming victory, but shortly after, Romulus, on the Palatine, saw 12 vultures. A heated argument ensued. Did the first sighting take precedence, or the greater number of birds? Romulus, confident in his superior sign, began to plough a furrow around the Palatine hill to mark the sacred boundary of his new city, the Pomerium. This was a solemn ritual. What happened next is a tragic and pivotal moment in Rome's foundation story. In one common version, Remus, still resentful and perhaps mocking his brother's efforts, jumped over the newly ploughed furrow and the low wall being erected, a sacrilegious act violating the sanctity of the new city's boundary. Enraged by this disrespect for his city and its nascent laws, Romulus struck Remus down, killing him. Some versions say Romulus himself did it. Others that one of his lieutenants, Sila, struck the fatal blow. Romulus is said to have lamented, "So will it be for all others who leap over my walls." Thus, the city of Rome, according to its most enduring legend, was founded on April 21, 753 BCE, by Romulus, but its birth was stained by fratricide. This act of violence at the very inception of Rome was something Roman thinkers and historians grappled with for centuries. It was a dark shadow, a reminder of the potential for civil strife that lay beneath the surface of Roman society. Yet, it also underscored the absolute sanctity of Rome's walls and laws, and the idea that the good of the city, its security and order, might demand even the harshest sacrifices. Romulus, now the sole founder, named the city Roma after himself. He established its first institutions, created a senate of 100 patres, fathers, the original patricians, and set about populating his new settlement. This led to another famous, and somewhat morally ambiguous, episode, the rape of the Sabine women. Rome, in its early days, was largely populated by men, adventurers, outcasts, and refugees from other areas. There was a shortage of women, and therefore no future for the city. When neighboring communities, like the Sabines, refused to allow their women to marry Romans, Romulus devised a plan. He announced a grand festival in honor of the god Consus, inviting the Sabines and other nearby peoples. In the midst of the festivities, at a prearranged signal, the Roman men rushed out and abducted the Sabine women. This act, understandably, led to outrage and war with the Sabines, led by their king, Titus Tatius. The fighting was fierce. In one famous incident, Tarpeia, the daughter of the Roman commander of the Capitoline Hill citadel, offered to betray the citadel to the Sabines in exchange for what they wore on their left arms, meaning their gold bracelets. The Sabines, disgusted by her treachery even as they benefited from it, crushed her to death with their shields, which they also carried on their left arms. The Tarpeian Rock, a cliff on the Capitoline, later became a place of execution for traitors. The final battle took place in the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline Hills, the future site of the Roman Forum. Just as the Sabines were gaining the upper hand, the abducted Sabine women themselves, now wives and mothers of Roman children, rushed between the fighting lines. With their hair unbound and clothes torn, they implored their fathers and brothers on one side, and their husbands on the other, to stop the bloodshed. They argued that whichever side won, they, the women, would be the losers, either as orphans or as widows. Their courageous intervention, born of a desire to unite their new and old families, was successful. The warriors, moved by their pleas, laid down their arms. Peace was made, and the Romans and Sabines agreed to merge into a single people. Romulus and Titus Tatius ruled jointly until Tatius's death some years later. This story, while involving abduction and conflict, ultimately emphasizes reconciliation, the merging of different peoples to create a stronger whole, and the crucial role of women in forging peace in society. It explained how Rome grew and incorporated others, a characteristic that would be vital to its later expansion. Romulus is said to have reigned for many years, establishing military, political, and social structures. His end, like his beginning, is shrouded in legend. One story tells that he was reviewing his troops when a sudden storm arose, and he was enveloped in a cloud and taken up to heaven by his father, Mars, to become the god Quirinus. Another, more cynical tradition whispered that he was murdered by resentful senators who dismembered his body and carried the pieces away under their robes. Whatever the truth, his deification as Quirinus provided Rome with a divine protector and reinforced the idea of the city's special connection to the gods. After Romulus, Rome was ruled by a series of 6 more kings, a period lasting roughly from 753 BCE to 509 BCE. While some of these reigns involved warfare, which we are deliberately sidestepping, many also contributed significantly to the peaceful development of the city's institutions and character. The immediate successor to Romulus was Numa Pompilius, a Sabine, renowned for his wisdom and piety. His reign is remembered as a golden age of peace and religious foundation. Unlike the warlike Romulus, Numa focused on establishing Rome's religious cults and priestly colleges. He is credited with building the Temple of Janus, whose gates were kept open in times of war and closed in times of peace. During Numa's entire long reign, the gates of Janus remained closed. This is a powerful symbol of the peace he cultivated. Numa also reformed the Roman calendar, dividing the year into 12 lunar months and adding January and February, bringing it more in line with the solar year. He established the major priestly orders, such as the Flamines, priests dedicated to specific gods, the Pontifices, who oversaw all religious matters, headed by the Pontifex Maximus, the Salii, dancing priests of Mars, and the Vestal Virgins, who tended the sacred flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, ensuring the city's spiritual well-being. Numa's contributions were seen as foundational to Roman law and religious observance, providing the city with a moral and spiritual compass. He was the embodiment of pietas and a belief in the importance of divine favor for the city's prosperity. His peaceful reign offered a counterpoint to Romulus's more martial beginnings, suggesting that both strength and piety were essential to Rome's character. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, is traditionally portrayed as much more warlike, and his reign involved the destruction of Alba Longa. However, even in this, we can find elements that are not solely about conflict. The famous story of the Horatii and the Curiatii, 3 Roman brothers fighting 3 Alban brothers to decide the outcome of the war, while a combat narrative, was also about individual sacrifice for the state and a way to avoid larger-scale bloodshed, at least initially. The eventual assimilation of the Alban population into Rome also speaks to the city's capacity for growth through incorporation rather than just annihilation. Next came Ancus Marcius, who was Numa Pompilius's grandson. He is credited with many public works that contributed to Rome's peaceful development. He supposedly founded the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, which would become crucial for Rome's trade and food supply. He built the first bridge across the Tiber, the Pont Sublicius, a wooden bridge, connecting the city to the Janiculum Hill. He also expanded the city and formally established the procedures for declaring war, the rites of the official priests, which, ironically, were intended to ensure wars were just and undertaken only as a last resort, emphasizing a legalistic and religious framework even around conflict. The last 3 kings of Rome were Etruscan: Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. The Etruscans were a more advanced civilization to the north of Rome, and their influence during this period was significant, particularly in terms of urban development, religious practices, and political organization. Tarquinius Priscus is said to have expanded the Senate, begun the construction of the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, Rome's most important temple, laid out the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing track, and started work on the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's main sewer system. These were all projects that enhanced the city's grandeur and livability. Servius Tullius, his successor, is particularly renowned for his social and political reforms, which had a lasting impact. He is credited with conducting the first census, a systematic counting and registration of Roman citizens and their property. This was not merely for taxation or military levies, but also for organizing the citizenry into voting assemblies, the comitia centuriata, based on wealth and status. This system, while hierarchical, provided a framework for citizen participation in government. Servius Tullius is also said to have built the Servian Wall, a defensive fortification around the city, though archaeological evidence suggests much of the surviving wall dates from a later period. His reforms aimed to create a more ordered and integrated state. The reign of the final king, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud, ended with a dramatic revolution that ushered in the Roman Republic in 509 BCE. While his reign is depicted as tyrannical, leading to his overthrow, the events surrounding the end of the monarchy, particularly the story of Lucretia, are more about the abuse of power and the Roman desire for liberty than about large-scale warfare. The story goes that Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped Lucretia, a noble and virtuous Roman matron. After revealing the crime to her husband and father, and making them swear an oath to avenge her, Lucretia took her own life. This act ignited the fury of the Roman nobles, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, an ancestor of the Brutus who would later assassinate Julius Caesar. They rallied the people, expelled Tarquin the Proud and his family from Rome, and abolished the monarchy forever, establishing a republic headed by 2 annually elected consuls. This event was foundational to the Roman hatred of kingship and their deep-seated commitment to republican ideals of liberty and self-government, at least among the elite. These founding myths and stories of the kings, whether historically accurate in every detail or not, were profoundly important. They provided the Romans with a shared narrative, a sense of identity, and a set of values. The piety of Aeneas, the divine favor shown to Romulus and Remus, the peace and religious order of Numa, the engineering feats of Ancus Marcius, the civic organization of Servius Tullius, and the rejection of tyranny with the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud. All these elements contributed to the complex picture Romans had of themselves and their city's destiny. They believed they were a people chosen by the gods, destined for greatness, but also bound by duty, tradition, and a commitment to the common good, at least in their idealized self-image. These stories were told and retold, depicted in art, and referenced in oratory and literature throughout Roman history, constantly reinforcing these core tenets of Roman eaters. Now, let us turn from these grand narratives of gods, heroes, and kings to the more intimate sphere of daily life. What was it like to live in this city, built upon such epic foundations? How did the average Roman, far removed from the legendary figures of the past, experience their world? The cornerstone of Roman society was the familia, the family. This was not just a nuclear family as we might understand it today, but a broader household unit under the authority of the paterfamilias, the eldest living male ascendant. The paterfamilias held considerable legal power, known as patria potestas, over his descendants, both male and female, including his adult sons, their wives and children, his unmarried daughters, and any adopted members of the family, as well as the household slaves. In theory, this power was absolute, extending even to life and death in the early republic, though by later periods, this was tempered by custom and public opinion. However, the paterfamilias was not simply a domestic tyrant. He was also the chief priest of the household, responsible for maintaining the family's religious rites, honoring the ancestral spirits, the lares and penates, and upholding the family's reputation and economic well-being. His role was one of duty and responsibility as much as authority. He was expected to be a wise and just steward of his family's affairs, consulting with senior family members, especially his wife, on important decisions. The Roman matron, the mater familias, while formally under the legal control of her paterfamilias, either her father or her husband, depending on the type of marriage, often wielded considerable influence within the household. She was responsible for managing the domestic sphere, overseeing the slaves, supervising the education of young children, and managing the household budget. Roman women, particularly those from affluent families, were often educated, sometimes to a high degree. They could own property in their own right, inherit wealth, and engage in business, though they were excluded from formal political life. Idealized as loyal, dignified, and industrious, the image of Lucretia spinning wool was a powerful one. Roman women played a crucial role in maintaining the social fabric and instilling Roman values in the next generation. Marriage was a vital institution, seen primarily as a means of producing legitimate children to continue the family line and form alliances between families. Marriages were often arranged, particularly among the elite. The wedding ceremony itself was rich in symbolism, involving rituals like the joining of hands, the offering of a cake, and the ceremonial carrying of the bride over the threshold of her new home to prevent a stumble, which would be a bad omen. Children were, of course, central to the family. Infant mortality was high, so the survival of a child was a cause for celebration. A newborn was not considered a full member of the family until formally accepted by the paterfamilias in a ceremony called the tollia liberum, where he would lift the child from the ground. Children played with toys much like those known today: dolls, balls, hoops, miniature carts, and board games. Education for boys from wealthier families often began at home with a tutor, often a Greek slave known as a pedagogus, who would accompany the boy to school. Schools, or ludi literarii, taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. At a higher level, boys might study grammar, rhetoric, literature, and philosophy, essential skills for a public career. Girls also received education, primarily at home, focusing on literacy, numeracy, and household management, though some, as mentioned, pursued more advanced studies. A significant rite of passage for a Roman boy was the assumption of the toga virilis, the toga of manhood, usually around the age of 14 to 16. This was a public ceremony where he put aside his childhood toga with a purple border, toga praetexta, and donned the plain white toga of a citizen, marking his entry into adult life and civic responsibility. Adoption was a common practice in Rome, especially among the elite, often used to ensure the continuation of a family line or to secure a political heir if no natural sons were available. Adopted sons gained the same legal rights and status as natural sons. Within the familia were also slaves and freedmen. Slavery was a pervasive feature of Roman society, and we cannot ignore it, though we will focus on their roles within the household rather than the brutalities of the system. Slaves performed a vast range of tasks: domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, childcare, agricultural labor, skilled crafts, and even secretarial and managerial duties for their masters. The conditions of slavery varied enormously. Some household slaves, particularly those who were educated or skilled, might be treated relatively well and could develop close relationships with the family. They could sometimes earn or be given a peculium, a sum of money or property they could manage and potentially use to purchase their freedom. Manumission, the freeing of a slave, was a common practice. Freed slaves, known as liberti or liberty, became Roman citizens, though with some limitations on holding public office, and often maintained ties of loyalty and obligation to their former masters, becoming their clients. Freedmen could achieve considerable success in Roman society, engaging in commerce and accumulating wealth. Let's move on to where these families lived. Roman housing varied dramatically depending on social class. The wealthy lived in a domus, a single family house, which could be quite luxurious. The traditional domus was inward-looking, centered around an atrium, a large central hall with an opening in the roof called a compluvium, which allowed light and air in, and rainwater to collect in a pool below called an impluvium. Off the atrium were various rooms: cubicula, bedrooms, aili, wings or alcoves, and the tablinum, which served as the master's study or office, where he might receive clients. Many larger domus also had a peristylium, an open courtyard or garden surrounded by a colonnade, offering a private space for relaxation. Dining often took place in a triclinium, a dining room with 3 couches arranged around a central table, where diners would recline to eat. The walls of a domus were often brightly painted with frescoes depicting mythological scenes, landscapes, or intricate patterns, and the floors might be adorned with elaborate mosaics. Amenities could include running water, private baths, and even heating systems where hot air was circulated under the floors and through wall cavities. The vast majority of Rome's population, however, lived in very different conditions, in multi-story apartment blocks called insulae, meaning islands. These were often shoddily constructed by speculative builders, prone to collapse or fire, a constant hazard in a densely packed city. The ground floor of an insula might be occupied by shops, tabernae, or workshops, with apartments on the upper floors. These apartments were often cramped, dark, and lacking in basic amenities like running water or sanitation. Residents would have to fetch water from public fountains and use public latrines. Cooking was often done on open braziers, increasing the fire risk. Despite these challenges, the insulae were vibrant centers of community life, with neighbors living in close proximity. Life spilled out into the streets, stairwells, and courtyards. Now, what did these Romans eat and drink? The Roman diet was based on the Mediterranean triad: grains, primarily wheat and barley, used for bread and porridge; olives, for olive oil, a crucial source of fat and used for cooking, lighting, and anointing the body; and grapes, for wine, the staple drink, usually diluted with water. Vegetables such as cabbage, lettuce, onions, garlic, and legumes like lentils and chickpeas were common. Fruits included figs, apples, pears, and plums. Meat was less frequently consumed by the general populace, though pork, poultry, and game were available. Fish and seafood were popular, especially near the coast. A typical Roman day might begin with a light breakfast, or ientaculum, perhaps some bread dipped in wine or eaten with cheese or olives. Lunch, or prandium, taken around midday, was also usually a simple, cold meal. The main meal of the day was the cena, eaten in the late afternoon or early evening. For ordinary Romans, this might be a hearty porridge, pools, bread, vegetables, and perhaps some fruit or cheese. For the wealthy, the cena could be an elaborate affair, a multi-course banquet lasting for hours, involving exotic dishes, entertainment, and lively conversation. Guests at a formal cena would recline on couches in the triclinium. Food was eaten with the fingers or with spoons. Forks were not commonly used. A popular, if pungent, condiment used throughout the Roman world was garum or liquamen, a fermented fish sauce, which came in various grades and was used to flavor many dishes, much like soy sauce in some Asian cuisines or Worcestershire sauce today. Food was purchased from local markets, where farmers brought their produce, and from the numerous tabernae that sold prepared foods and drinks. The way Romans dressed was also distinctive and reflected their social status. The most iconic garment was the toga, a large woolen robe, semicircular in shape, worn draped over the body. The toga was the formal attire of adult male Roman citizens. It was impractical for manual labor and was primarily a symbol of citizenship and public life. There were different types of togas: the plain white toga virilis of the ordinary citizen, the toga praetexta, with a purple border, worn by magistrates, priests, and freeborn boys. the toga candida, whitened with chalk, worn by candidates for public office, hence our word candidate, and the toga pulla, a dark toga worn for mourning. Underneath the toga, or as everyday wear, Romans wore a tunic, a simple sleeved garment, usually made of wool or linen, reaching to the knees or ankles. Women also wore tunics, often longer than men's. Over her tunic, a respectable Roman matron would wear a stola, a long, sleeveless dress, often pleated, fastened at the shoulders with brooches. When going out, she would also wear a palla, a large rectangular shawl draped over her head or shoulders. Footwear consisted mainly of sandals, solii, for indoors, and shoes or boots, calcii, for outdoors. Romans paid attention to their appearance. Hairstyles for women could be quite elaborate, involving curls, braids, and hairpieces, changing with fashion. Men were generally clean-shaven and wore their hair short, at least during the Republic and early Empire. Cosmetics, made from various minerals and plant extracts, were used by women to whiten their skin, redden their lips and cheeks, and darken their eyebrows and eyelashes. Jewelry, such as rings, bracelets, necklaces, and earrings, made of gold, silver, and precious stones, was popular among those who could afford it. What did Romans do for work? This wasn't an empire built solely on myth and leisure. Agriculture was the backbone of the Roman economy and the primary occupation for the majority of the population. Small family farms and large slave-run estates, latifundia, produced the grain, wine, olives, and other foodstuffs that sustained the empire. In the cities, a wide array of crafts and trades flourished. There were potters making ceramics, smiths working with metal, weavers producing textiles, tanners, shoemakers, carpenters, and stonemasons involved in construction. Many of these artisans worked in small workshops, often located on the ground floor of insulae, selling their wares directly to the public. Merchants and traders facilitated the movement of goods, both locally within markets and over long distances, connecting Rome with its provinces and even lands beyond its borders. The city of Rome itself was a massive consumer, requiring vast imports of grain, wine, oil, and luxury goods. Shopkeepers ran tabernae selling all sorts of commodities. There were also professions requiring literacy and education, scribes who copied documents, teachers, doctors, though medical practice was a mix of empirical observation and folk remedies, lawyers who advised on legal matters and represented clients in court, and orators who spoke in the law courts or political assemblies. Publicans, or tax collectors, were often wealthy equestrians who bid for contracts to collect taxes in the provinces, a role that was essential for state revenue but often unpopular. Even with all this work, Romans also knew how to enjoy their leisure time, and the state often provided public entertainment. One of an institution in Roman life was their public baths, or thermae. These were not just places to get clean, they were vast complexes that served as social and recreational centers. A visit to the baths might involve a sequence of rooms: a changing room, appetiterium, a warm room, tepidarium, a hot room, caldarium, and a cold plunge bath, frigidarium. Baths often included exercise areas, palestri, swimming pools, libraries, lecture halls, gardens, and food stalls. They were places to meet friends, conduct business, exercise, relax, and gossip. They were accessible to people of all social classes, often with low entrance fees or even free admission at certain times. The theatre was another popular form of entertainment. Romans enjoyed both comedies and tragedies, many of which were adaptations of Greek plays. The comedies of Plautus and Terence, with their stock characters, witty dialogue, and farcical situations, were particularly beloved. Theatrical performances took place in large, open-air theatres, often as part of religious festivals. Actors, who were usually slaves or freedmen, wore masks to indicate their characters. While gladiatorial games and beast hunts were a major and violent form of spectacle, which we are consciously avoiding in detail, it's important to note their existence as a significant part of Roman public entertainment. Chariot racing, held in vast arenas called circuses, the most famous being the Circus Maximus in Rome, was an immensely popular spectator sport. Teams, distinguished by colors, red, white, blue, and green, had passionate followings, and successful charioteers could become wealthy celebrities. The races were thrilling and dangerous, with chariots pulled by 2, 4, or even more horses thundering around the track. The excitement, the roar of the crowd, and the partisan support for the different factions made race days major social events. Beyond these large public spectacles, Romans enjoyed simpler pleasures. Board games, such as Ludus la Trunculorum, a game of military strategy, or tabula, similar to backgammon, were popular. Dice games were also common, though often associated with gambling, which was officially frowned upon but widely practiced. Romans also appreciated gardens and public parks, which offered green spaces for strolling and relaxation within the bustling city. Numerous religious festivals punctuated the year, providing holidays and opportunities for feasting, processions, and public rituals. These festivals, dedicated to various gods and goddesses, were important communal events that reinforced social cohesion and religious piety. Speaking of religion, it permeated every aspect of Roman life, from the grand state cults to the private worship of household deities. The Romans had a vast pantheon of gods and goddesses, many of whom were adopted from or equated with Greek deities. The Capitoline Triad, Jupiter Optimus Maximus, king of the gods, equivalent to Zeus, Juno, his wife, queen of the gods, equivalent to Hera, and Minerva, goddess of wisdom, crafts, and strategic warfare, equivalent to Athena, were the most important state gods, with a magnificent temple on the Capitoline Hill. Other major deities included Mars, god of war, but also originally an agricultural deity, Venus, goddess of love and beauty, mythical ancestress of the Roman people through Aeneas, Neptune, god of the sea, Ceres, goddess of agriculture, Apollo, god of music, prophecy, and healing, Diana, goddess of the hunt and the moon, Mercury, god of trade and messenger of the gods, Vesta, goddess of the hearth and home, and Bacchus, god of wine and ecstasy. Religious practice involved prayer, sacrifices, which could range from simple offerings of grain, fruit, or wine to animal sacrifices on important occasions, and the observance of rituals. Divination played a crucial role, as Romans believed it was important to ascertain the will of the gods before undertaking any significant action. Augurs interpreted divine signs from the flight of birds or the behavior of sacred chickens, while haruspices examined the entrails of sacrificed animals for omens. Priests, organized into various colleges like the pontifices, flamines, and augurs, oversaw religious ceremonies and maintained the pax deorum, the peace of the gods, a state of harmony between Rome and the divine realm, which was considered essential for the city's safety and prosperity. The Pontifex Maximus was the head of the state religion. In addition to the public state cults, Romans practiced private, domestic worship. Each household had its lares, spirits protecting the home and family, and penates, guardians of the storeroom. Small shrines, or lararia, were maintained in homes, where the paterfamilias would lead daily prayers and offerings. Ancestor veneration was also important, with portrait masks, imagines, of distinguished ancestors displayed in noble homes and paraded at funerals. Festivals were numerous and varied. Saturnalia, in December, was a particularly joyous festival in honor of Saturn, a god of agriculture and the Golden Age. It was a time of feasting, gift-giving, role reversal, slaves were sometimes served by their masters, and general merrymaking. Lupercalia, in February, was a more ancient and wilder fertility festival, involving priests running through the city striking women with goatskin thongs to promote fertility. These festivals provided a rhythm to the year and reinforced communal bonds. As Rome developed, various philosophical schools, primarily from Greece, also gained influence, particularly among the educated elite. Stoicism, with its emphasis on reason, virtue, duty, and emotional self-control, resonated strongly with traditional Roman values like gravitas and constantia. Epicureanism, often misunderstood as promoting hedonism, actually advocated for a life of simple pleasures, tranquility, and freedom from fear and pain, achieved through understanding the natural world. These philosophies offered frameworks for ethical living and personal well-being. The daily life we've described was supported and shaped by Rome's remarkable infrastructure. The Romans were master engineers, and their public works had a profound impact on urban living. We've already mentioned the Cloaca Maxima, the great saw that drained the marshy areas of the Forum and carried waste away from the city center. Roman roads, famously straight and well-constructed, crisscrossed the empire, facilitating communication, trade, and the movement of people, not just armies. Within the city, paved streets allowed for easier movement, though they were often crowded and noisy. Aqueducts were perhaps the most visually stunning examples of Roman engineering. These massive structures, often carried on arches over long distances, brought vast quantities of fresh water into the city from distant springs and rivers. This water supplied the public baths, fountains, from which many citizens got their daily water, and the homes of the wealthy. Access to clean water was crucial for public health and hygiene. The Forum Romanum, originally a marshy valley, became the heart of Roman public life. It was a sprawling complex of temples, basilicas, large public buildings used for law courts and business, government offices, shops, and monuments. It was here that senators debated, orators addressed the people, merchants conducted business, religious ceremonies took place, and citizens gathered to hear news and socialize. It was the symbolic center of the city and the empire. Other public buildings, such as libraries and theaters, further enriched urban life. Finally, a brief word on Roman social structure, without focusing on conflict. Roman society was hierarchical. The main early division was between patricians, the aristocratic families who traced their lineage back to the earlier senators appointed by Romulus, and plebeians, the common citizens. Initially, patricians held most of the political and religious power. However, over several centuries of social and political development, the conflict of the orders, which, while a struggle, was often resolved through negotiation and legal changes rather than constant warfare, plebeians gained access to all offices and achieved political equality. By the late Republic, the distinction between patrician and plebeian was less important than distinctions based on wealth and political achievement. The senatorial class, composed of men who had held high office and their families, formed the governing elite. Below them was the equestrian class, the equites, wealthy citizens who often engaged in business, finance, and tax collecting, and who filled many administrative roles. Citizenship itself was a prized status, granting legal rights and privileges. Initially confined to the inhabitants of Rome, it was gradually extended to other peoples in Italy and eventually, under Emperor Caracalla in 212 CE, to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire. This inclusivity, this ability to incorporate diverse peoples into the Roman identity, was one of Rome's great strengths. So, as we draw this first exploration to a close, we see a Rome built on powerful stories of divine destiny and heroic endeavor, but also a Rome of bustling streets, complex family lives, diligent work, shared leisure, and deep religious feeling. The Romans saw themselves as a people of order, tradition, and practicality, inheritors of a grand legacy, and participants in a vibrant, if sometimes challenging, daily existence. Their myths informed their values, and their daily practices reflected those values, creating a civilization that, even without focusing on its military might, was undeniably remarkable in its complexity, its endurance, and its profound influence on the world that followed. The echoes of their language, their laws, their architecture, and their ideas of civic life resonate even now, inviting us to look beyond the battlefield and appreciate the rich tapestry of Roman life. We continue our exploration of the Roman Empire, moving away from the grand narratives of its founding and the intimate details of daily life, to something that physically connected every corner of its vast territory, the Roman roads. The saying, "all roads lead to Rome," isn't just a quaint proverb. It reflects a profound reality. The Romans were master road builders, and their extensive network of highways was the circulatory system of the empire, vital not for conquest in our discussion, but for commerce, communication, the spread of ideas, and even for something we might recognize today as tourism or leisure travel. These weren't just dusty tracks, they were marvels of engineering, built to last, and many of their routes are still in use today, sometimes forming the foundations of modern highways. The sheer scale of the Roman road network is astonishing. At its peak, it's estimated that there were over 400,000 kilometers, or roughly 250,000 miles, of roads crisscrossing the empire, of which about 80,500 kilometers, or 50,000 miles, were paved highways of the highest quality. These vie publici, or public roads, were the main arteries, connecting major cities, provincial capitals, and strategic points. But beyond these, there was a dense network of secondary roads, vie vicinals, linking towns and villages, and even private roads, vie privati, leading to individual estates and farms. This intricate web ensured that, theoretically, no part of the empire was truly isolated. The primary purpose, from the state's perspective, was often initially strategic, to move troops and supplies quickly. However, the unintended, or perhaps secondary, consequences for peaceful interaction and economic development were immense and are our focus today. So, how did the Romans build these incredible feats of engineering, roads so durable that sections have survived for 2 millennia? It began with meticulous planning and surveying. Roman surveyors, known as agrimensors or grammatici, after their primary tool, the gromma, were highly skilled professionals. The gromma was a surveying instrument consisting of a vertical staff with a horizontal cross from which 4 or 5 plumb lines were suspended. By sighting along these plumb lines, surveyors could lay out straight lines and right angles, essential for the famously direct routes of Roman roads. Romans preferred straight roads wherever possible, even if it meant overcoming significant geographical obstacles. They would aim for a landmark in the distance and plot a direct course. If a hill was in the way, they would often cut through it. If a valley or swamp presented itself, they would build a causeway or embankment. This directness was a hallmark of their practical, efficient approach. Other surveying tools included the chorobates, a long wooden level used to ensure flat gradients, crucial for drainage and ease of travel, and the dioptra, a more complex instrument for measuring angles. Once the route was surveyed and marked out, the construction process began, a labor-intensive undertaking that often involved the army, especially during periods of peace when legionaries could be put to work on public projects. Slaves and local conscripted labor were also used, particularly under the supervision of military engineers or private contractors. The standard Roman road was a sophisticated, multi-layered structure, designed for durability and all-weather use. The width varied depending on the importance of the road, but a major public highway might be around 4 to 6 meters wide, enough for 2 carts to pass, with footpaths often running alongside. The construction typically followed a series of steps. First, a trench, or fossa, would be dug, sometimes several feet deep, down to solid bedrock if possible. The earth removed from the trench was often used to build up an embankment, or agger, on which the road would be laid. This agger raised the road surface above the surrounding terrain, which aided drainage and gave travelers a better view. The agger itself could be quite substantial, sometimes several feet high and many feet wide, especially in marshy areas. Then came the layers. The lowest layer, the statumen, consisted of large, rough-hewn stones, often set in mortar or packed clay, providing a stable foundation. Above this was the rudus, a layer of smaller stones, gravel, or rubble, mixed with lime mortar, creating a strong, concrete-like base. This layer was thoroughly compacted, often by tamping. Next came the nucleus, a layer of finer gravel, coarse sand, or small pieces of pottery and brick, also mixed with lime and compacted. This formed a firm, smooth base for the final paving. The top layer, the actual road surface, was known as the summum dorsum or pavimentum. For the most important roads, this consisted of large, tightly fitted polygonal or rectangular paving stones, or silex, often made of hard volcanic basalt, flint, or limestone, depending on local availability. These stones were carefully shaped and laid to create a durable, relatively smooth surface. The surface was often cambered, meaning it was slightly higher in the center and sloped down towards the edges, allowing rainwater to run off into drainage ditches that typically flanked the road. This attention to drainage was crucial for the longevity of the road, preventing water from undermining the foundations. This layered construction method, almost like a sandwich of different materials, made Roman roads incredibly strong and resistant to wear and tear from heavy traffic and harsh weather. They were built to endure. Beyond the roadbed itself, Roman road builders incorporated other impressive engineering features. Bridges, or pontes, were essential for crossing rivers. Early Roman bridges were often made of wood, like the Pont Sublicius in Rome, but they soon became masters of stone arch bridge construction. Using voussoirs, wedge-shaped stones, to create strong, self-supporting arches, they built magnificent stone bridges, many of which still stand and are used today. The Pont du Gard in southern France, while primarily an aqueduct, also carries a road and showcases their mastery of arch construction. They also built causeways across marshes and viaducts across deep valleys. Tunnels were less common but were constructed when necessary to maintain a direct route through mountainous terrain. These were often cut through solid rock using manual labor and sometimes fire setting, heating the rock and then dousing it with cold water to crack it. Examples include the Furlow Pass Tunnel in Italy. To help travelers navigate this extensive network and know distances, milestones, or milliaria, were erected along major roads. These were cylindrical stone columns, typically inscribed with a distance to the next major town or to Rome itself, from which all distances were measured along the main highways, the name of the emperor who built or repaired that section of road, and sometimes other information. The Golden Milestone, or Miliarium or Rome, erected by Augustus in the Roman Forum, was a symbolic column from which all distances in the empire were notionally measured. These milestones were the ancient equivalent of modern road signs and distance markers. Once built, these vital arteries needed to be maintained. The responsibility for the cura viarum, or care of the roads, was taken very seriously. Initially, local landowners might be responsible for maintaining sections of road passing through their property. However, for the major public highways, the state played a significant role. Special officials, curators viarum, were appointed, often men of senatorial or equestrian rank, to oversee the upkeep and repair of specific roads or regions. Funding for road maintenance came from various sources, including state revenues, tolls collected on some roads and bridges, contributions from municipalities, and sometimes forced labor or contributions from local communities. Regular inspections and repairs ensured that the roads remained in good condition, though the quality of maintenance could vary depending on the period and the region. Now, let's consider who used these roads and for what peaceful purposes. One of the most significant impacts of the Roman road network was on commerce. While sea transport was generally cheaper for bulk goods over long distances, roads were essential for inland trade, connecting agricultural hinterlands to urban markets and linking different regions of the empire. A vast array of goods moved along these roads. Agricultural produce, grain, wine, olive oil, fruit, vegetables, and livestock was transported from farms and estates to towns and cities. Raw materials, such as timber, stone for building, and metals from mining areas, were carried to where they were needed. Manufactured goods, like pottery, the ubiquitous Samian ware, for example, was traded widely. Glassware, textiles, tools, and metalwork traveled from production centers to consumers across the empire. Luxury items from distant lands, silks from the east, spices, incense, precious stones, and exotic animals for the games, though we focus on the goods themselves, also found their way along these routes, often as part of longer trade networks that extended beyond the empire's frontiers. The vehicles used for transporting goods were generally slow and heavy. The most common was the plaustrum, a heavy, two-wheeled ox cart with solid or spoked wheels, suitable for carrying bulk goods over shorter distances. For longer journeys and slightly faster transport, four-wheeled wagons, known as radae or carus, drawn by mules or horses, were used. These could carry passengers as well as goods. The pace of travel for such heavy wagons was slow, perhaps only 15 to 25 kilometers, 10 to 15 miles, a day. Lighter, faster carts, sometimes drawn by a single horse or mule, could cover more ground. To support this constant flow of traffic, a network of roadside inns and service stations developed. Official stopping places, established by the state primarily for users of the cursus publicus, the imperial postal service, which we'll come to, were called mansions. These were substantial establishments, located roughly a day's journey apart, offering accommodation, food, and fresh horses. They were essentially official guest houses. Between the mansions, at shorter intervals, were mutations, which were primarily relay stations for changing horses and obtaining minor repairs or refreshments, but might not offer overnight lodging. While these were for official use, private travelers and merchants often relied on private inns, or corpani and tabani, the latter term also meaning shops. The quality of these private inns varied enormously. Some were reputable establishments offering decent food and clean lodging, while others were notorious for being dirty, overcrowded, and frequented by unsavory characters. Roman literature often paints a grim picture of the discomforts and dangers of staying in a low-quality inn. Fleas, noisy fellow travelers, and dishonest innkeepers were common complaints. However, the existence of this infrastructure, however imperfect, was crucial for facilitating long-distance trade and travel. The economic impact of this road-facilitated commerce was profound. Roads helped to integrate regional economies, allowing areas to specialize in producing goods for which they were best suited and trade them for goods from other regions. This fostered economic growth and prosperity. Markets in towns and cities could be supplied with a wider variety of goods from further afield, improving the standard of living, at least for those who could afford it. The efficient movement of goods also helped to stabilize prices and ensure food supplies, particularly for large urban centers like Rome itself, which depended heavily on imports. While we are avoiding military aspects, the general security provided by Roman rule, often referred to as the Pax Romana, Roman peace, made long-distance trade along these roads relatively safe, at least during the empire's more stable periods, further encouraging commercial activity. Beyond the movement of goods, Roman roads were absolutely vital for communication. The empire was a vast administrative entity, and the ability to send messages and officials quickly and reliably across its territories was essential for governance. This led to the development of the cursus publicus, the imperial postal and transport service, established by Augustus. This was not a public postal service in the modern sense, available to everyone for sending letters. Rather, it was reserved for official state business, carrying government dispatches, transporting officials, and moving tax revenues or military supplies. The cursus publicus relied on the network of roads, mansions, and mutations. Couriers, carrying official documents, could travel at impressive speeds by using relays of fresh horses. It's estimated that a message could travel up to 80 kilometers, 50 miles, a day by horse-drawn carriage, and urgent dispatches carried by riders changing horses frequently could cover 240 kilometers, 150 miles, or even more in a single day under optimal conditions. This allowed the emperor and his administration in Rome, or provincial governors, to maintain relatively rapid communication with distant parts of the empire, a crucial factor in holding such a large territory together. Officials traveling on state business were issued with a diploma, or warrant, authorizing them to use the facilities of the cursus publicus. While the cursus publicus was for official use, private individuals also needed to communicate. Wealthy Romans would send letters via their own slaves or hired messengers. Merchants often had their own networks for sending commercial correspondence. For those who couldn't afford a private messenger, letters might be entrusted to traveling acquaintances or merchants heading in the right direction. The roads, therefore, facilitated not just official communication but also the flow of private news, business information, and personal correspondence, helping to bind together a society that was spread across a vast geographical area. Scholars could correspond with colleagues in distant cities, families could keep in touch, and friendships could be maintained across provinces. The roads carried words and ideas just as effectively as they carried goods and people. Now, let's turn to a particularly interesting aspect of Roman road use: leisure travel, or what we might call vacations. The concept of otium, or leisure, was highly valued by upper-class Romans, seen as a time for intellectual pursuits, relaxation, and enjoyment, a contrast to negotium, or business and public duties. For those who had the means and the time, travel for pleasure was a popular activity. Roman roads made such travel feasible and relatively comfortable, at least for the wealthy. What were the popular destinations for these Roman tourists? The Bay of Naples, with its beautiful coastline, mild climate, and luxurious villas, was a highly fashionable resort area, much like the French Riviera or a Caribbean island today. Wealthy Romans, including emperors, owned lavish seaside villas at places like Baiae, Puteoli, and Herculaneum. Baiae, in particular, was famous for its hot springs and its hedonistic atmosphere. People went there to see and be seen, to enjoy the scenery, the sea air, and the social life. Another popular type of destination was the countryside estate. Many affluent Romans owned rural villas, or villi rustici, which were often working farms but also served as peaceful retreats from the noise and bustle of the city. Spending time at one's country villa, overseeing the estate, engaging in philosophical discussions with friends, reading, writing, and enjoying the simpler pleasures of rural life was an idealized form of otium. Writers like Pliny the Younger have left us detailed descriptions of their beloved villas and the leisurely routines they enjoyed there. Travel to famous cities of the Greek world, such as Athens, Corinth, or the cities of Asia Minor like Ephesus, was also popular, especially for those interested in culture, philosophy, and art. These cities offered a connection to the classical Greek heritage that Romans deeply admired. Young men, as part of their education, might undertake a form of grand tour, visiting these centers of learning and culture. Alexandria in Egypt, with its great library and lighthouse, was another major attraction. Religious sanctuaries and healing spas also drew travelers. People would journey to famous oracles, like Delphi in Greece, though its prominence waned in the Roman period, or to cult centers of healing gods, such as Asclepius at Epidaurus or in Pergamum. Natural hot springs, valued for their therapeutic properties, became sites of health resorts, like Aquae Sulis, modern Bath in England, or the aforementioned Baiae. How did wealthy Romans travel for leisure? While some might ride horses, the most comfortable mode of transport for long distances was often the lectica, or litter. This was a couch or covered seat, carried on poles by slaves. It offered a smooth ride and protection from the elements, and allowed the traveler to read, write, or rest. For those who preferred wheeled transport, there were more comfortable carriages than the basic raider. The caruca was a more luxurious, often four-wheeled, sprung carriage, sometimes elaborately decorated, which could be used for family travel. These would be drawn by horses or mules. The experience of a Roman traveler was, in some ways, not unlike that of a modern tourist. They might consult itineraria, which were essentially roadbooks or route planners. Some itineraria were simple lists of towns and distances along a particular route, like the Antonine itinerary, while others, like the Putinger table, a medieval copy of a Roman original, were actual maps, albeit highly schematic and distorted, showing roads, towns, and geographical features. Travelers might seek out famous sites, collect souvenirs, and experience local customs and cuisines. They would have to deal with the practicalities of finding accommodation, changing money, and perhaps navigating language differences in the more distant or less Romanized parts of the empire, though Latin and, to a lesser extent, Greek served as lingua francas in many areas. The infrastructure supporting leisure travel also developed. In popular tourist destinations, there were often high-quality inns and villas available for rent. Wealthy individuals might own multiple properties in different locations, allowing them to move between their city residence, their seaside villa, and their country estate according to the season or their inclination. The peaceful impact of this vast road network extended beyond just commerce and individual travel. The roads were conduits for the spread of Roman culture, language, and ideas. As people moved along these routes, merchants, administrators, soldiers, in their peaceful construction roles or when returning home, scholars, and travelers. They carried with them Roman customs, architectural styles, artistic tastes, and, crucially, the Latin language. This facilitated a process of Romanization in many provinces, not necessarily through force, but through interaction, imitation, and the perceived benefits of adopting Roman ways. The roads helped to create a more interconnected and culturally, though not entirely uniformly, Roman world. They fostered social interaction on an unprecedented scale. People from different regions, with different backgrounds and local traditions, could meet and mingle in the markets, inns, and cities connected by the road system. This could lead to a greater understanding, or at least familiarity, between diverse populations, contributing to a sense of shared identity, or at least participation in a common Roman system. For those who traveled, the roads opened up a wider world, expanding horizons and providing new experiences. The roads also played a crucial role in the administration of justice and the maintenance of order in a non-military sense. Officials could travel to dispense justice, resolve disputes, and oversee local government. The ability to communicate effectively and move administrative personnel helped to ensure that Roman law, one of Rome's most enduring legacies, could be applied, however imperfectly, across the empire. Even the very act of building and maintaining roads could be a source of local pride and economic benefit, providing employment and stimulating local economies through the demand for materials and services. The roads were tangible symbols of Roman power and organization, but also of Roman investment in the provinces. They represented a commitment to infrastructure and connectivity that benefited many, not just the state. Finally, the legacy of Roman roads is immense. Many modern European roads still follow the routes laid down by Roman engineers 2,000 years ago. The straightness, the careful construction, and the strategic placement of these ancient highways meant that they continued to be the best, and often the only, major routes for centuries after the Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. Their influence can be seen in the layout of cities and the patterns of settlement across Europe. Beyond the physical remains, the Roman road network stands as a testament to Roman engineering prowess, organizational skill, and their vision of a connected world. They were, in a very real sense, the lifelines of a civilization, facilitating not just the mechanics of empire, but the human interactions, the economic exchanges, and the cultural flows that defined Roman life in its more peaceful aspects. The roads were more than just stone and gravel. They were pathways for civilization, commerce, and the quiet, everyday journeys of millions of people across a vast and diverse empire. They allowed for an unprecedented level of mobility and interconnectedness in the ancient world, shaping the landscape and the lives of those who traveled upon them. Whether for the urgent business of the state, the vital transactions of trade, or the simple human desire to explore, to rest, or to connect with others in distant places. Continuing our walk through a Roman neighborhood, the sights, sounds, and especially the smells inevitably lead us to think about food. For the Romans, like for us, food was not just about survival. It was about community, tradition, and the daily rhythm of life. So, let's explore where Romans got their food, what they ate, and how they transformed raw ingredients into daily meals. The first stop for anyone needing provisions would be the market. Roman cities and towns, even smaller ones, were typically well served by markets of various kinds. The grandest in Rome itself were specialized wholesale markets like the Forum Boarium for cattle or the Forum Holatorium for vegetables, located near the river for easy transport of goods. But for most everyday shopping, people would frequent the local macellum. A macellum was often a purpose-built market building, sometimes quite elaborate, with a central courtyard surrounded by covered porticos lined with shops and stalls. Imagine a bustling, open space, perhaps with a central fountain or a tholos, a circular structure, where fishmongers displayed their freshest catch on cool stone slabs, the scales glistening, the air carrying the distinct briny scent of the sea or river. Around them, other vendors would have their wares laid out. Stalls would be piled high with seasonal vegetables, leafy cabbages, bunches of leeks and onions, earthy turnips and radishes, plump gourds, and delicate asparagus in season. Baskets would overflow with legumes, lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans, staples of the Roman diet. Fruit sellers would offer tempting displays of figs, a Roman favorite, both fresh and dried, apples, pears, plums, and perhaps more exotic imported dates or peaches if the market was in a wealthier area or a major port city. The air would be a complex medley of smells, the sweet fragrance of ripe fruit, the earthy aroma of vegetables, the sharp tang of cheeses, and the sometimes overwhelming scent from the butcher's section. Butchers, or lani, would be at work, skillfully carving carcasses of pork, the most commonly consumed meat, lamb or goat. Poultry, such as chickens, ducks, and geese, would also be available, often sold live for maximum freshness. Beef was less common for everyday eating, as oxen were more valuable as draft animals for farming, but it wasn't entirely absent. Game, like wild boar, deer, hare, and various birds, might also be found, brought in by hunters. The sounds of the market would be as vibrant as its sights and smells. Vendors would shout to attract customers, praising the quality of their goods. Shoppers would haggle animatedly over prices, a customary part of the transaction. There would be the chatter of conversations, the laughter of children, perhaps the music of an itinerant performer trying to earn a few coins. It was a lively, social atmosphere, a place not just to buy food but to meet neighbors and exchange news. Beyond the central Makella, individual tabernis specializing in particular foodstuffs lined the streets. The pister at his pistrinum, or bakery, was a vital figure. The smell of baking bread would drift out from these establishments, drawing customers in. Romans consumed vast quantities of bread, and bakeries offered various types, from coarse, dark bread for the poor to finer, whiter loaves for those who could afford them. Some bakeries had their own mills for grinding grain, often powered by donkeys or mules endlessly circling, a common sight and sound. Wine shops, or vinerii, sold the staple drink of the Roman world. Wine, usually diluted with water, was consumed by almost everyone. Amphorae, the tall clay jars used for transporting and storing wine, would be stacked high, their stoppers indicating the origin and quality of the contents. Olive oil, another cornerstone of the Mediterranean diet and Roman life, used for cooking, lighting, and as a skin cleanser, would be sold in similar shops, with different grades available, from the finest virgin oil to cheaper varieties. Shopping was often a daily affair, especially for perishable goods like fresh vegetables, meat, and fish, as most people lacked refrigeration. Wealthier households would send slaves to do the marketing, armed with a shopping list and a purse. The slave would be expected to inspect the goods carefully, ensuring freshness and quality, and to negotiate the best possible prices. For ordinary folk, shopping was a personal task, a chance to interact directly with the producers and vendors. So, what were these Romans buying? The foundation of their diet was the Mediterranean triad: grains, olives, and grapes. Wheat was the primary grain, milled into flour, farina, for bread. Barley was also common, often used to make pools, a thick porridge that was a staple for many, especially in earlier times and among the poorer classes. Vegetables, as we've seen, were abundant and varied. Romans appreciated fresh produce and incorporated a wide range into their diet. In addition to those already mentioned, they ate cucumbers, artichokes, and various wild greens and mushrooms when in season. Garlic and onions were used extensively for flavoring. Fruits were a popular part of the diet, eaten fresh or dried for later use. Figs were particularly beloved and cultivated widely. Pomegranates, cherries, and later, peaches, introduced from Persia, added variety. Meat consumption varied by social class and location. Pork was the most popular and widely available meat. Sausages and preserved pork products were common. Poultry was also a regular feature. Fish and seafood were highly prized, especially in coastal cities or those with good river access. A vast array of fish, from humble sardines to prized sea bass or mullet, found its way to Roman tables. Shellfish, particularly oysters, were considered a delicacy. A ubiquitous flavoring, found in almost every Roman kitchen, rich or poor, was garum or liquamen. This was a fermented fish sauce, made by layering small fish with salt and allowing them to break down in the sun. It came in different grades and prices, and added a savory, umami flavor to many dishes, much like soy sauce in East Asian cuisine or Worcestershire sauce today. Its production was a major industry, and the smell from a garum factory must have been incredibly potent. Dairy products consisted mainly of cheese and, to a lesser extent, milk. Romans were skilled cheesemakers, producing a wide variety of fresh and aged cheeses from sheep's or goat's milk. Cow's milk was less commonly consumed by adults. To flavor their food, Romans used a range of locally grown herbs like rosemary, thyme, sage, mint, parsley, fennel, and coriander. Mustard seed was used to make a pungent condiment. Honey was the primary sweetener, as sugar cane was unknown to them. Salt was, of course, essential for seasoning and preservation. More exotic spices, like black pepper from India, were available but very expensive, a luxury for the wealthy. Once the ingredients were procured, how were they transformed into meals? Let's look at the typical Roman day of eating. The first meal, taken early in the morning, was the ientaculum, or breakfast. This was generally a light and simple affair. It might consist of a piece of bread, perhaps dipped in wine or olive oil, or eaten with a little cheese, some olives, or a few dates or drizzle of honey. For many working people, it would have been a quick bite before heading off to their labors, sometimes eaten on the go. Leftovers from the previous evening's cena might also serve as breakfast. Around late morning or midday, Romans would have their prandium, or lunch. This too was usually a fairly light meal, often cold, especially in warmer weather. It might include bread, cheese, cold meats if available, fruit, vegetables, like a salad of greens or cucumbers, and nuts. Like breakfast, it could be eaten at home, or taken to work, or bought from a thermopolium for those out and about. It was not typically a major sit-down meal for most people. The main meal of the day, and the most substantial, was the cena, or dinner. This was usually eaten in the late afternoon or early evening, as daylight faded. The nature of the cena varied dramatically depending on social status and wealth. For the vast majority of ordinary Romans, especially those living in cramped insulae with limited or no cooking facilities, the cena would have been relatively simple. The cornerstone was often pulse, that thick porridge of emmer wheat or barley. This could be made more substantial and flavorful by adding chopped vegetables, beans, lentils, cheese, or small pieces of bacon or sausage if affordable. Bread, accompanied by vegetables, perhaps boiled cabbage or a dish of lentils, and some fruit, would also be common. Meat or fish would be an occasional treat rather than a daily staple for the poorest. Many would rely on the aforementioned thermopolia for hot food, buying portions of stew or grilled items. For wealthier Romans, those living in a domus with a proper kitchen and staff, the cena could be a much more elaborate affair, the social highlight of the day. If guests were invited, it could become a banquet. Such a meal would typically be eaten while reclining on couches in a dining room called a triclinium. It might begin with a gestatio, or appetizer course, featuring items like eggs prepared in various ways, olives, raw vegetables, a sort of crudité platter, salads, shellfish, or small savory pastries. The main course, or prima mensa, would follow, potentially consisting of several dishes. This is where the host would showcase more expensive ingredients. Roast or stewed meats, pork, lamb, kid, poultry, game, elaborate fish dishes with rich sauces, and carefully prepared vegetables would be served. Sauces were very important in Roman elite cuisine, often complex and designed to surprise the palate, frequently using garum, wine, honey, herbs, and spices. Finally, there would be the secunda mensa, or dessert course. This typically consisted of fresh fruit, nuts, walnuts, almonds, hazelnuts, and honeyed cakes or pastries. Wine, usually mixed with water, drinking it undiluted was considered barbaric, would be served throughout the meal, its flow managed by a magister bibendi, or master of drinking, chosen from among the guests, who would decide the ratio of wine to water and the number of toasts. Now, how was this food actually cooked? The cooking environment differed vastly. A wealthy domus would have a dedicated kitchen, or culina, equipped with a raised hearth for open-fire cooking, charcoal braziers, and sometimes even a built-in bread oven. There might be a sink with running water if the house was connected to an aqueduct. The kitchen would be stocked with a range of cooking utensils, earthenware pots, olli, for boiling and stewing, bronze or iron pans, sartagens, for frying, grills, spits for roasting, knives of various sizes, ladles, spoons, and sieves. A crucial piece of equipment in any Roman kitchen was the mortarium, a sturdy ceramic or stone bowl with a roughened interior, used with a pestle for grinding herbs, spices, grains, and for making sauces and preparations like maritum. In contrast, the inhabitants of insulae often had very limited cooking facilities. Many apartments lacked a dedicated kitchen space. Cooking would be done on a portable charcoal brazier, the foculus, placed in a room or on a balcony, a constant fire risk. Some insulae might have had communal ovens, or people would take their dough to a commercial bakery to be baked. For many, as mentioned, the easiest option for a hot meal was to buy it from a street vendor or a thermopolium. Let's consider some typical, simpler dishes that would have been common, rather than the extravagant fare of elite banquets described by writers like Apicius, whose cookbook, De Re Coquinaria, reflects a very luxurious style of cuisine. The most basic, as discussed, was pulse. To make a simple version, emmer wheat or barley grains would be cooked slowly with water or milk and a pinch of salt until thick and soft. To make it more interesting, one might stir in grated cheese, chopped leeks or cabbage, lentils, or perhaps some diced bacon or salt pork for flavor. A drizzle of olive oil on top would finish it. This was the Roman equivalent of polenta or grits, a hearty and filling base for a meal. A popular rustic dish, described in a poem attributed to Virgil, was maritum. This was a sort of herb and garlic cheese spread. It involved pounding together fresh cheese, likely sheep's or goat's milk cheese, several cloves of garlic, fresh coriander, parsley, perhaps some rue, a bitter herb, a little olive oil, and a splash of vinegar, seasoned with salt, all in a mortarium. The resulting green, pungent paste would be eaten spread on coarse bread, a simple, flavorful, and nutritious peasant meal. Eggs were a common and versatile ingredient. A simple dish was over spongia exlact, a sort of fluffy, soufflé-like omelette. Eggs would be beaten with milk, a little olive oil, and perhaps a pinch of salt, then cooked gently in a shallow pan until set. A sweet version could be made by adding honey to the mixture before cooking. Lentil stew, or lenticular, was another staple. Lentils would be simmered with water or a simple broth, along with chopped onions, leeks, and perhaps some fresh coriander. Small pieces of salt pork or sausage could be added if available to make it richer. A dash of garum or a sprinkle of herbs like savory or thyme would complete the dish. This was a nutritious and cheap source of protein. Bread, or ponies, was central. While much bread was bought from bakeries, simple flatbreads could be made at home. A basic dough of flour, water, and salt, sometimes with a sourdough starter as a leavening agent, would be kneaded and then cooked on a hot stone by the fire, in a covered pot set in embers, or in a shallow pan. For those who could afford meat, roasting was a common method. A chicken or a piece of pork might be simply seasoned with salt and local herbs like rosemary or thyme, then roasted on a spit over an open fire or in a simple oven. Vegetables were often boiled or stewed. Cabbage, for example, might be boiled and then dressed with olive oil and salt, perhaps a little vinegar. Beets were often served cold, dressed with mustard and vinegar. A simple but significant item was libum, a type of small cheesecake. Cato the Elder, in his treatise on agriculture, gives a recipe. Pound 2 pounds of cheese well in a mortar. When it is well mashed, add 1 pound of wheat flour, or, if you want it to be more delicate, only half a pound of fine flour, and mix it well with the cheese. Add 1 egg, and beat the whole well. Then make it into loaves, place them on leaves, and bake slowly on a warm hearth under an earthen pot. This was often used as a sacrificial cake offered to household gods, but also eaten as a treat. The flavors of Roman cooking were generally robust and savory, relying heavily on the natural taste of fresh ingredients, enhanced by olive oil, garum, wine, vinegar, honey, and a wide array of herbs. While wealthy Romans enjoyed complex dishes with expensive imported spices, the everyday cooking of the majority was simpler, more rustic, but no less important in sustaining the life of the empire. From the bustling markets to the humble cooking brazier, the story of Roman food is a story of resourcefulness, tradition, and the enduring human need to gather, prepare, and share sustenance. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forums and down the narrow alleyways, a palpable shift would occur in a Roman neighborhood. The intense energy of the day, with its commerce, its public gatherings, and its relentless movement, would gradually subside, replaced by a different kind of activity, and eventually a different kind of quiet. For the Romans, night was not merely an absence of day. It was a distinct phase of life, with its own character, routines, and anxieties. The preparations for nightfall would begin as the light faded. Shopkeepers, the tabernarii, would start to secure their premises. The wide openings of their street-front shops, which had been invitingly open all day, would be closed off with heavy wooden shutters or doors, often barred from the inside. Artisans would put away their tools, bakers would bank their ovens, and market vendors would pack up any unsold goods or cover their stalls. The sounds of commerce, the hammering, the sawing, the shouting of prices, would give way to the sounds of closing up, the rumble of shutters, the clank of bolts, and the murmur of final conversations. For those living in a domus, the wealthier single-family homes, the evening might involve the lighting of oil lamps throughout the house. These lamps, typically made of terracotta or bronze, burned olive oil and provided a flickering, warm light. The paterfamilias might spend some time in his tablinum, study, reviewing accounts or reading by lamplight. The family might gather for the cena, the main evening meal we discussed earlier, which could be a lengthy and social affair if guests were present. After the meal, there might be conversation, the reading of poetry, or perhaps some quiet family time before retiring. Personal hygiene before bed was simpler than our modern routines. While the grand public baths were for daytime use, a wealthy Roman might have a slave bring a basin of water for washing hands and face. In the crowded insulae, the preparations for night were perhaps more urgent and less leisurely. With darkness came increased risks. Residents would ensure their doors, often flimsy, were secured as best as possible. Those living on upper floors would have already made their trips to the public fountains for water. Cooking on open braziers, if done in the evening, would need to be carefully managed to avoid the ever-present danger of fire. Oil lamps, though essential, were also a fire hazard in these timber-heavy structures. Many poorer Romans would have used cheaper, simpler lamps, or even just rushlights or candles made from tallow, which provided a dimmer, smokier light. As true darkness enveloped the city, the soundscape changed dramatically. The cacophony of the day, the street cries, the rumble of carts, which were largely banned from city centers during daylight hours in Rome to ease congestion, meaning night was often when supply wagons moved, the chatter of crowds would diminish. However, Roman cities were rarely completely silent, especially a metropolis like Rome itself. You might still hear the distant rumble of those heavy supply carts making their way through the wider streets, their iron-rimmed wheels echoing on the stone. The barking of dogs was a perennial sound, as was the occasional braying of a donkey or the lowing of cattle being brought in for the next day's market. Within the insulae, sounds from neighboring apartments would travel easily through thin walls and floors. A crying baby, a cough, a heated argument, or perhaps the sounds of a late-night gathering. Revelers returning home late from a popina, tavern, or a private party might disturb the peace with their loud talk and singing. The vigils, the night watchmen established by Augustus, would patrol the streets. Their footsteps, the clatter of their equipment, and their occasional calls might be heard, offering some reassurance against the dangers of the night, though their effectiveness in preventing crime or quickly extinguishing fires in a vast city was always a challenge. One of an overwhelming sensations of Roman city night, especially away from the main thoroughfares or the homes of the wealthy, would have been the profound darkness. Street lighting as we know it did not exist. While some major public buildings or the entrances to wealthy homes might be lit with torches or large lamps, most streets and alleys would be pitch black. This made navigating the city at night treacherous. One could easily trip on uneven paving stones, fall into an open drain, or stumble into refuse. The darkness also provided cover for less savory activities. Mugging and burglary were real fears. Those who had to venture out at night would usually carry their own light source, a lantern, lanterna, with sides made of translucent horn or bladder, or a simple oil lamp, and would often travel in groups or be accompanied by slaves carrying torches for protection. The poet Juvenal, in his satires, paints a vivid and rather terrifying picture of the dangers of Roman nights, from things being thrown out of upper-story windows to encounters with drunken bullies or robbers. Inside their homes, Romans prepared for sleep. Bedding varied greatly with social status. In a wealthy domus, bedrooms, or cubicula, were often small, sometimes windowless rooms, or with only small, high windows for ventilation rather than light, intended purely for sleeping. The bed itself, the lectus cubicularis, could be a relatively elaborate piece of furniture, made of wood or bronze, with a mattress stuffed with straw, wool, feathers, or even reeds. It would be furnished with pillows, pulvini, and blankets or coverlets, vests straguli or operamenta. Some beds might have had curtains for privacy or warmth. For the majority living in insulae, sleeping arrangements were far more basic. A simple mat or pallet laid on the floor might serve as a bed. Families often slept together in a single room to conserve space and warmth. Overcrowding was the norm. The concept of a private bedroom for each individual, or even each couple, was a luxury few could afford. The air in these crowded rooms could become stuffy and close overnight. Once settled for the night, what did Romans think about? What were their dreams and fears? Sleep, for the Romans, was not just a physical necessity but also a state in which one could receive messages or omens. Dreams, or somnia, were often taken very seriously. They could be seen as communications from the gods, warnings about the future, or reflections of one's anxieties or desires. There was a whole industry of dream interpretation. Individuals might consult professional dream interpreters, interpret somniorum, or look up the meaning of their dreams in dream books, much like some people do today. Certain types of dreams were considered particularly significant. Flying, for example, could portend success or a journey. Dreams involving snakes, teeth falling out, or encounters with the dead often carried specific, sometimes ominous, interpretations. Public figures, like emperors or generals, paid close attention to their dreams, believing they could hold clues to matters of state. Pliny the Younger recounts dreams of his own and of his friends, discussing their possible meanings with a mixture of belief and rational skepticism that was characteristic of many educated Romans. The content of dreams would naturally reflect the daily lives and concerns of the dreamers. A merchant might dream of a successful voyage or a shipwreck. A farmer might dream of a good harvest or a drought. A mother might dream of her children's health and well-being. The gods and goddesses of the Roman pantheon frequently appeared in dreams, offering guidance, warnings, or sometimes enigmatic pronouncements. Beyond the realm of dreams, the night could also be a time of very real fears. The fear of fire was perhaps the most pervasive in urban settings. With so many wooden structures, open flames for cooking and lighting, and crowded conditions, a small accident could quickly escalate into a devastating conflagration. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, during Nero's reign, was a traumatic event that lived long in the city's memory and led to stricter building codes, but the danger always remained. Waking up to the smell of smoke or the shouts of fire, Ignis, would have been a terrifying experience. The fear of building collapse was another significant anxiety for insular dwellers. These often poorly constructed buildings could and did fall down, sometimes with little warning, especially after heavy rains or due to structural weaknesses. Being trapped in a collapsing building was a horrific prospect. Crime was also a major concern. Burglary, furtum, was common. While wealthy homes might have strong doors, barred windows, and household slaves to act as guards, poorer dwellings were much more vulnerable. The darkness of the streets also made assault and robbery a constant threat for anyone out at night. Supernatural fears also played a part in the Roman night. The darkness was thought to be a time when spirits, ghosts, lemures or larvae, often seen as malevolent spirits of the dead, and other supernatural entities were more active. People might perform rituals or use amulets to ward off evil spirits or bad luck. Stories of haunted houses or encounters with ghosts were common. Magic and witchcraft, maleficium, were also things people feared, believing that curses or spells could be cast against them, especially under the cover of darkness. Certain nights, like those of the Lemuria festival in May, were specifically dedicated to appeasing or exorcising restless spirits. Health concerns could also loom larger at night. Illnesses could seem worse in the quiet and darkness, and access to medical help would be limited. The chill of the night air was often thought to be unhealthy, and people would try to keep warm. However, the night was not solely a time of fear and anxiety. For some, it could be a time of peace and quiet, a respite from the demands of the day. Scholars and writers might find the stillness of the night conducive to study and composition. Lovers might find opportunities for clandestine meetings. And for everyone, sleep offered a necessary period of rest and recuperation, a chance to escape the toils and troubles of waking life, even if only for a few hours. The transition from night back to day would begin subtly. The first hint of dawn, the prima lux, would gradually lighten the eastern sky. Roosters, the natural alarm clocks of the ancient world, would begin to crow. Slowly, the city would stir. The sounds of early risers, the first vendors setting up their stalls, the distant clang of a blacksmith already at work, these would signal the end of the night and the beginning of a new cycle of activity. For the Romans, as for all people, the night was a time of vulnerability and rest, of dreams and fears, a fundamental part of the human experience, lived out against the unique backdrop of their ancient world. The anxieties were perhaps more acute, the comforts fewer for many, but the basic human need for sleep and the complex inner world that accompanies it remained a constant. As the last vestiges of twilight surrendered to complete darkness, the Roman world transformed. We've touched upon the practicalities of securing homes and the initial sounds of the evening, but the experience of night was more than just the absence of day. It was a period with its own distinct character, influencing everything from social interactions to deeply personal fears and spiritual beliefs. Let's reconsider the bedtime routines, or lack thereof, for many. While the wealthy might have a more structured end to their day, for the urban poor crammed into insulae, bedtime was likely dictated by the setting of the sun and the exhaustion from a long day's labor. There wasn't leisure time for elaborate evening rituals. The priority was finding a space to lie down, often sharing cramped quarters with multiple family members or other tenants. The concept of a quiet, private bedroom was an unimaginable luxury for most. Instead, sleep was snatched amidst the ongoing life of the building, the snores, coughs, and movements of others in close proximity. The thin walls and floors offered little sound insulation, meaning that a neighbor's argument, a baby's cry, or even intimate activities in an adjacent room would be part of the nocturnal soundscape. The sounds from outside the insulae also permeated the night. We mentioned the rumble of supply carts, but other noises punctuated the darkness. The city wasn't entirely asleep. Taverns, popini, in some districts might remain open late, their noise spilling into the streets. Occasional shouts, bursts of drunken laughter, or the sound of a scuffle could disturb the quiet. The vigils, the night watch, on their patrols, might call out to each other or challenge anyone moving suspiciously in the dark. Animal sounds were also common, the ubiquitous barking of dogs, the hooting of owls, and perhaps the scuttling of rats in the alleyways or within the walls of the buildings themselves, a constant, unwelcome presence for many. In a city as large as Rome, even at night, there was a low, pervasive hum of life that never entirely ceased. For those who couldn't sleep, the night could be long and unsettling. Without electric light, the darkness was profound and could feel oppressive. The flickering flame of a small oil lamp, if one could afford the oil, offered only a small circle of light against the encroaching shadows. This deep darkness naturally played on the imagination. Every creak of the building, every unfamiliar sound from the street, could be magnified and take on a sinister meaning. This brings us back to the fears that accompanied the Roman night. The fear of fire, as we've noted, was paramount. But there was also the fear of illness striking in the dark. With limited medical knowledge and access to healers often difficult at night, a sudden fever or acute pain could be terrifying. Infant and child mortality rates were high, and many parents would have spent anxious nights listening to a child's labored breathing, praying for the dawn. The supernatural fears we touched upon were deeply ingrained. Roman religion was polytheistic and animistic, with a belief in spirits inhabiting all aspects of the natural world. The night was considered a time when the veil between the human world and the spirit world was thinner. Lemures and larvae, the restless and often malevolent spirits of the dead who had not received proper burial rites or who had died violently, were thought to wander at night. People might leave out offerings or perform specific rituals to appease these spirits and keep them from entering the home. The festival of Lemuria, held in May, involved the paterfamilias rising at midnight and performing a ritual to exorcise these ghosts from a household, throwing black beans over his shoulder and chanting specific formulas. This indicates how seriously such beliefs were taken. Funerary practices themselves reflected some of these nocturnal anxieties. Funerals for adults were generally held during the day. However, infants or very young children who died were often buried at night, perhaps reflecting a belief that their spirits were more vulnerable or that their passing was a private sorrow, less a matter for public display. Dreams continued to be a significant aspect of the Roman night. Beyond personal interpretations, dreams could have public implications. If an emperor or a prominent senator had a particularly vivid or disturbing dream, it might be discussed with priests or soothsayers, and could even influence policy decisions or lead to public expiatory rites if the dream was deemed a bad omen for the state. The interpretation of dreams was a complex art, with different symbols holding various meanings, often dependent on the dreamer's circumstances. For example, dreaming of clear water might be a good omen, while dreaming of muddy water could signify trouble. Recurring dreams were given particular attention. The quality of sleep itself was, of course, variable. For the laborer exhausted by a day of physical toil, sleep might come easily, despite uncomfortable conditions. For the scholar or the statesman, worries and responsibilities might follow them into the night, making sleep elusive. The Roman writer Aulus Gellius, in his Attic Nights, mentions the use of soothing music or the sound of gently falling water as aids to sleep for those suffering from insomnia, suggesting that sleeplessness was a recognized problem. The physical environment of the bedroom, or sleeping space, also mattered. While the wealthy had dedicated cubicula, these were often small and located in the interior of the domus, away from street noise. They might be decorated with frescoes, though perhaps simpler than those in the public reception rooms. The focus was on creating a quiet, secure space. For the poor in insulae, there was no such luxury. They slept where they could, often in rooms that served multiple purposes during the day. Ventilation could be poor, and in summer, the heat in these upper-story rooms under the sun-baked tiles could be stifling, making sleep difficult. In winter, the cold would seep in, and families would huddle together for warmth under whatever blankets or cloaks they possessed. Consider also the routines associated with waking. There were no alarm clocks beyond the crowing of roosters or the increasing light of dawn. The workday for many started very early, often at first light. So, waking was not a leisurely affair. For those who had to fetch water, this would be an early morning chore. For bakers, their day started long before dawn to ensure bread was ready for morning customers. The transition from the sleeping world to the waking world was also a time for recalling and perhaps discussing dreams. Family members might share their dreams, particularly if they seemed significant or troubling. This sharing of dream narratives was another aspect of social bonding and a way of processing anxieties and hopes. It's also worth noting that the Roman concept of a consolidated 8-hour sleep, as is often idealized today, might not have been the norm for everyone. Some historical sleep researchers have proposed that a segmented sleep pattern, where individuals might sleep for a few hours, wake up for a period of quiet activity or contemplation in the middle of the night, and then return to sleep for a second period, was common in pre-industrial societies. While direct evidence for this in Rome is sparse, the nature of Roman nights, with their potential for interruption and the different rhythms of life, makes it a plausible pattern for some. The very end of the night, just before dawn, the Gallicinium, cockcrow, held a certain significance. It was the signal that the deepest part of the night was over, and the world was about to reawaken. This was often the time when the vigils were most alert, as it was a period when those who had committed crimes under cover of darkness might try to slip away. The Roman night, therefore, was far from a period of uniform inactivity or peace. It was a complex tapestry woven from the need for rest, the persistence of urban sounds, the anxieties about safety and the supernatural, and the rich inner world of dreams. For the wealthy, it might offer a private space for reflection or continued social interaction in well-lit homes. For the poor, it was often a continuation of the struggle for existence, seeking rest in crowded and insecure conditions. Yet, for all Romans, nightfall brought a necessary pause, a drawing inward, and a confrontation with the darkness that was both literal and metaphorical, before the city once again burst into life with the arrival of the new day. The shared experience of navigating these nocturnal hours, with its common fears and hopes, was another thread that bound Roman society together. The Roman concept of otium stood in contrast to negotium, which encompassed business, public duties, and the general toil of daily work. For those with the means, otium was an opportunity to cultivate the self, engage in intellectual pursuits, enjoy the company of friends, and partake in the many pleasures the Roman world had to offer. But even for the working populace, festivals, public holidays, and the availability of communal leisure facilities provided regular breaks from labor and chances for enjoyment. Perhaps no institution is more emblematic of Roman leisure and daily life than the public baths, or thermae. These were far more than just places to get clean. They were vast, often opulent complexes that served as comprehensive social, recreational, and cultural centers. Imagine stepping into one of the grand imperial baths in Rome, like the baths of Caracalla or Diocletian, or even a more modest bathhouse in a provincial town. The scale could be breathtaking. These were not dingy, utilitarian washhouses. They were often architectural marvels, adorned with mosaics, marble statues, frescoes, and soaring vaulted ceilings. A typical visit to the baths followed a set routine. Upon entering, you would first go to the appoditerium, the changing room. Here, you would undress and leave your clothes in niches or with an attendant, though theft from bathhouses was a common complaint, so one had to be careful. From there, you might proceed to the palestra, an open-air exercise yard, often surrounded by a colonnade. Here, men, and sometimes women, though often in separate facilities or at different times, could engage in various forms of exercise: wrestling, weightlifting with rudimentary dumbbells, ball games, like harpastum, a vigorous team game, or simply light jogging and stretching. After working up a sweat, the bathing ritual itself would begin. This usually involved moving through a sequence of rooms with different temperatures. First, you might enter the tepidarium, a warm room, designed to allow the body to acclimatize. It was often a place for relaxing and socializing before proceeding to hotter or colder environments. Next would be the caldarium, the hot room. This room was heated by a hypercourse system, where hot air from a furnace circulated under the raised floor and through cavities in the walls. The air in the caldarium was hot and steamy, similar to a modern sauna or steam room. It often contained a pool or basin of hot water for soaking. Here, bathers would sweat profusely, cleansing their pores. Strigils, curved metal scrapers, were used, often with olive oil, to scrape dirt and dead skin from the body. One might scrape oneself or pay an attendant to do it. Following the intense heat of the caldarium, the next stop was usually the frigidarium, the cold room. This room contained a large, unheated pool for a bracing cold plunge, which was believed to close the pores and invigorate the bather. The shock of the cold water after the heat was considered both therapeutic and refreshing. Some larger baths also had an open-air swimming pool, the natatio. But the thermae offered much more than just bathing and exercise. They were true community centers. Within their precincts, you could often find libraries, where one could read scrolls of literature or philosophy. There were lecture halls where poets might recite their latest works, or philosophers might give talks. Art galleries displayed statues and other works of art. There were gardens for strolling and quiet contemplation. Food and drink stalls sold refreshments. People met friends, conducted business deals, gossiped, played board games, or simply relaxed and watched the world go by. The baths were democratic spaces, accessible to almost everyone. Entrance fees were typically very low, or even free on certain days, thanks to the generosity of emperors or wealthy benefactors. Men and women usually bathed separately, either in different sections of the complex or at different designated hours. The baths were an integral part of Roman daily life, a place to care for the body, engage the mind, and connect with fellow citizens. Another major form of public entertainment was the theatre. Romans enjoyed a variety of theatrical performances, many of which were adapted from Greek originals, but with distinct Roman flavors. Theatres themselves were impressive structures, typically large, semicircular, open-air buildings with tiered seating, often built into a hillside or constructed with elaborate stone substructures. The stage, or scaena, was usually backed by an ornate architectural facade, the scaeni fronds, with multiple doorways for actors' entrances and exits. Comedies were particularly popular. The plays of Plautus and Terence, written during the Republic, remained favourites for centuries. These comedies often featured stock characters: the clever slave, the braggart soldier, the lovesick young man, the stern father, the cunning courtesan. The plots involved mistaken identities, farcical situations, witty dialogue, and often a good deal of slapstick humour. Audiences would roar with laughter at the antics on stage. Tragedies, often based on Greek myths, were also performed, though perhaps with less popular appeal than comedy. These plays explored grand themes of fate, power, and human suffering. Roman tragedies, such as those by Seneca the Younger, were often quite bloody and filled with intense emotion, perhaps reflecting a Roman taste for strong spectacle. Beyond formal comedy and tragedy, other forms of theatrical entertainment flourished. Mime was hugely popular. Roman mimes were not silent performers as we might think of them today. They were short, often improvised plays, usually on themes of everyday life, often bawdy and satirical. They included dialogue, song, and dance, and, uniquely for Roman theatre, female roles were played by women. In comedy and tragedy, male actors played all parts. Pantomime was another beloved form. In pantomime, a single, masked male performer, accompanied by music and a chorus that sang the story, would act out mythological tales or historical scenes through elaborate dance and gesture. These pantomime artists could be highly skilled and achieve great fame. Actors, histriones or actors, in ancient Rome generally had a low social status, often being slaves or freedmen. Despite this, successful actors could become wealthy celebrities with large followings. They typically wore masks to indicate the character they were playing: old man, young woman, slave, etc., and to help project their voices in the large theatres. Costumes could be elaborate. Theatrical performances were often staged as part of religious festivals, ludi scaenae, and were free to the public, funded by magistrates or the emperor. The atmosphere in a Roman theatre was likely lively and interactive, with audiences cheering, booing, and expressing their opinions openly. For sheer, unadulterated excitement and mass spectacle, nothing could quite match the chariot races held in the circuses. The Circus Maximus in Rome was the largest and most famous, a colossal U-shaped arena that could reputedly hold over 150,000 spectators, and some estimates go even higher. Imagine the scene on race day: the vast stadium packed with a roaring crowd, the emperor or presiding magistrate in his box, and down on the sandy track, the chariots and their highly skilled drivers, the aurigi. Chariot races typically involved four main factions, or teams: the reds, the whites, the blues, and the greens. Later, the purples and golds were added. These factions had fiercely loyal supporters, much like modern sports teams. People would wear their faction's colors, bet heavily on the outcome, and passionately cheer on their favorite drivers. The races themselves were thrilling and dangerous. Chariots, light two-wheeled vehicles, were usually pulled by teams of 4 horses, quadrigi, though sometimes 2, bigai, or even more horses were used. The drivers, often slaves or freedmen who could achieve immense fame and fortune if successful, wore protective leather helmets and tunics in their faction's color. They wrapped the reins tightly around their waists, carrying a knife to cut themselves free in case of a crash, a frequent occurrence, especially at the sharp turns around the meti, the turning posts at each end of the central barrier, or spina. A typical race consisted of 7 laps around the spina, which was often decorated with statues, obelisks, and lap counters, often in the shape of eggs or dolphins that were removed or tilted as each lap was completed. The skill of the charioteers in maneuvering their horses at high speed, the thundering hooves, the roar of the crowd, the risk of spectacular crashes, all combined to create an electrifying atmosphere. A day at the races was a major social event, a chance for people of all classes to come together and share in a common passion. While grand public spectacles catered to the masses, private entertainment, especially for the wealthy, often revolved around the feast or convivium. A Roman dinner party could be an elaborate affair, lasting for many hours. Guests, usually numbering around 9, 3 to a couch, with 3 couches arranged around a central table in the triclinium, would recline to eat. The meal itself, as we've discussed, could involve multiple courses of exotic and artfully prepared dishes. But a convivium was about more than just food and wine. It was a social occasion, a chance for conversation, wit, and entertainment. Hosts might hire musicians to play the lyre, the flute, or the kithara. dancers, acrobats, or jugglers might perform between courses. Sometimes, poets would be invited to recite their latest works, or there might be readings from literature. Philosophical discussions were also common, particularly if the host and guests were of an intellectual bent. Conversation was a key element, with guests expected to contribute witticisms, interesting stories, or learned observations. The quality of the entertainment and conversation was as important as the quality of the food and wine in determining the success of a feast. Of course, not all feasts were so refined. Some could become raucous and drunken affairs, as satirized by writers like Petronius in his Satyricon. For ordinary Romans, an evening meal would be far simpler, but the principle of sharing food and company with family and friends remained a core social pleasure. Beyond these more active forms of leisure, Romans also valued quieter pursuits and spaces for relaxation and intellectual enrichment. Public libraries, first established in Rome by Augustus and later endowed by other emperors and wealthy individuals, provided access to literature for those who could read. These libraries, often housed in impressive buildings, sometimes attached to temple complexes or baths, contained collections of scrolls, and later, codices, in both Latin and Greek. They would have reading rooms where scholars and interested citizens could consult works of history, poetry, rhetoric, philosophy, and science. While literacy was not universal, it was relatively widespread, especially in urban centers and among the upper and middle classes. Libraries were symbols of Roman culture and learning. Wealthy individuals also often had extensive private libraries in their homes. Gardens, or horti, offered another escape from the bustle of urban life. Roman cities, despite their density, often incorporated public parks and gardens, providing green spaces for strolling, meeting friends, or simply enjoying nature. These might be formally laid out with flower beds, shady trees, fountains, statues, and colonnaded walkways. Wealthy Romans also lavished great care on their private gardens. A domus often had an internal courtyard garden, the peristylium, which served as an outdoor living room. Villas in the countryside were famous for their elaborate pleasure gardens, with carefully landscaped terraces, ornamental plantings, fish ponds, grottos, and pavilions offering scenic views. For the Romans, gardens were places of beauty, peace, and contemplation, an attempt to bring the idealized order and tranquility of nature into their living spaces. Writers like Pliny the Younger described their gardens with great affection, detailing the layout of paths, the types of plants, and the pleasure they derived from spending time in these cultivated landscapes. Social clubs, known as collegia or sodalitates, played a significant role in the leisure lives of many Romans, particularly those of the working and middle classes. While some collegia were primarily trade guilds or professional associations, many also served as social, religious, and burial societies. Members would pay regular dues and in return would benefit from companionship, mutual support, and organized social activities. These clubs often had their own meeting places, sometimes with a dining room and a shrine to a patron deity. They would hold regular communal meals, celebrate festivals together, and provide a proper burial for deceased members, which was a matter of great importance in Roman society. These collegia fostered a sense of community and belonging, offering a social network and leisure opportunities outside the family or workplace. They were a vital part of the social fabric of Roman cities. Even simpler forms of leisure filled the daily lives of Romans. Board games were extremely popular across all social classes. Games like Ludus la Trunculorum, a game of strategy, sometimes compared to chess or checkers, tabula, similar to backgammon, and various dice games, tesserae or tali, were played in homes, taverns, and even in public spaces. Gambling on these games was common, though officially frowned upon and sometimes subject to legal restrictions. Children had their own games, of course, playing with dolls, hoops, balls, and toy chariots, or engaging in imaginative play. Conversation and storytelling were also fundamental forms of leisure. In a world without mass media, oral communication was paramount. People would gather in public spaces, in shops, at the baths, or in homes to exchange news, share stories, discuss politics, discreetly, depending on the political climate, and simply enjoy each other's company. The art of conversation was valued, and witty or eloquent speakers were admired. The Roman commitment to public leisure spaces and entertainment, from the grandeur of the imperial baths and circuses to the more intimate settings of libraries, gardens, and neighborhood collegia, reveals a society that understood the importance of otium for the well-being of its citizens and the vibrancy of its urban life. These spaces and activities were not mere frivolities. They were integral to what it meant to live a Roman life, fostering community, providing pleasure, and offering opportunities for both physical and intellectual enrichment. We spoke of the Roman baths, the thermae, as more than mere cleansing facilities. Let's immerse ourselves a little deeper into their atmosphere. Imagine the sheer scale of one of the great imperial baths in Rome. As you approached, you'd be met by an imposing facade, perhaps surrounded by gardens and porticos. Entering the apoditerium, the changing room, the air would be filled with the murmur of voices, the shuffling of feet, and the sounds of people disrobing. Attendants, often slaves, would be on hand, some trustworthy, others less so. Bathhouse thieves were a notorious problem, and satirical writers like Marshall often lamented the loss of a towel or tunic. You might see people anointing themselves with oil before exercise, or others being helped by their personal slaves. Moving into the palestra, the exercise yard, the scene would be one of activity. Men, and in some facilities or at separate times, women, engaged in various sports. You might see a group playing trigon, a fast-paced ball game involving 3 players throwing balls to each other. Others might be lifting rudimentary weights, practicing wrestling moves, or simply running laps. The sounds would be of grunts, shouts, the thud of balls, and the encouragement of onlookers. This wasn't just about fitness. It was also a social space, a place to see and be seen. The transition into the heated rooms was a sensory experience. The tepidarium, the warm room, offered a gentle, humid warmth. The air would feel soft on the skin. This room was often lavishly decorated, a place for leisurely conversation, for acclimatizing before the more intense heat of the caldarium, or for relaxing afterwards. Businessmen might conduct quiet deals here, friends might catch up on gossip, or philosophers might engage in debate. The caldarium itself was an immersion in heat. Depending on the bath, it could be a dry heat like a sauna, loconicum, or a steamy heat. The underfloor hypercourse system radiated warmth through the marble floors, which could become quite hot to the touch. Basins of hot water invited soaking, and the air would be thick with steam and the scent of oils and perfumes used by bathers. Here, the main business of cleansing took place, with vigorous scraping using strigils. The sound of scraping, splashing water, and the low hum of conversations in the steamy atmosphere would fill the air. Then came the invigorating shock of the frigidarium. The cold plunge pool was a central feature, and the sensation of hitting the icy water after the intense heat was a key part of the bathing experience, believed to be highly beneficial for health. The sounds here were of splashes, gasps, and exhilarated shouts. Beyond these core bathing rooms, larger thermae were like miniature cities. Imagine wandering through colonnaded walkways, discovering alcoves with intricate mosaics depicting mythological scenes or aquatic life. You might find a quiet library, its shelves lined with Greek and Latin scrolls. Attendants would be on hand to fetch texts for readers. In another area, a poet might be declaiming his latest verses to a small audience, or a rhetorician might be giving a public lecture. Food vendors would have stalls selling snacks and drinks, perhaps honey cakes, fruit, or cups of diluted wine. Masseurs offered their services, pummeling and kneading tired muscles. The sheer variety of activities available meant that a visit to the baths could easily occupy several hours, a complete afternoon of leisure and social interaction. It was a microcosm of Roman society, where people of different backgrounds, though often with subtle social segregation within the vast spaces, could mingle in a shared pursuit of cleanliness, health, and pleasure. The engineering behind these complexes, especially the constant supply of fresh water through aqueducts and the sophisticated heating systems, was a testament to Roman ingenuity and their commitment to public well-being. Let's revisit the theatres. We mentioned comedies and tragedies, but Roman theatrical entertainment was broader. A tell and farce, for instance, was an early form of Italian comedy, characterized by stock characters, like Macus the Fool or Papoose the Old Man, improvised dialogue, and often crude, slapstick humor. These farces were earthy and appealed to a wide audience. The physical structure of the Roman theatre was designed for both spectacle and audibility. The semicircular seating area, the cavea, often built into a hillside or supported by massive arched substructures, provided good sightlines. Seating was usually segregated by social status. Senators and equestrians had the best seats at the front, while women and the poorer citizens were often relegated to the upper tiers. The stage itself, the pulpitum, was a raised platform. Behind it, the scaeni frons, the permanent architectural backdrop, could be incredibly elaborate, with multiple stories, columns, niches for statues, and several doors used for dramatic entrances and exits. Sometimes, sophisticated stage machinery, the pegmata, allowed for special effects, like gods appearing to descend from the heavens, deus ex machina, or characters vanishing through trapdoors. Audience behavior in a Roman theatre was far from demure. Spectators were vocal and demonstrative. They would cheer for their favorite actors or plays, and boo or hiss at performances they disliked. They might stamp their feet, clap, or even throw things. Food and drink were consumed during performances. Patrons, wealthy individuals, or magistrates often sponsored these theatrical productions, ludi skinasai, as a way to gain popularity or fulfill civic duties. These events were free to the public and were often part of larger religious festivals, underscoring the connection between entertainment, religion, and civic life. The atmosphere was one of communal participation, a shared experience of laughter, sorrow, or excitement, depending on the genre. Alright, that is all for this video. If this AI-generated and narrated slop is not enough to make you sleep by now, nothing will. Maybe you should check another video of mine out. Maybe you'll fall asleep then. Until then, goodbye and good night. Hope you learnt something from this AI slop. See you, cutie pie.